Hello, comrades. Welcome, everybody. I would love to welcome you and thank you all for joining our first conference. My name is Mishka, as some of you may know, and I am going to be your host and moderator today. I am also one of the founders of ISALA, that is the Internationalist Solidarity Alliance for Latin America. We are an organization that posts news about current situation in Latin America, mainly Cuba and Venezuela, since lately these two countries have been affected by the American imperialism the most. We also have our website where we post articles, art, and have a separate segment for donations for Cuba. Like I said, I am one of the founders of ISALA alongside Marcelina, our Polish Venezuelan comrade, and Masha. She's our comrade from Russia. There is also Carlo from Italy and Elena and Giza from Hungary. Those are our amazing collaborators. They are responsible for writing articles and creating educational videos. Now I will give voice to Comrade Masha, and she's going to tell you a few words about ISALA's mission and our goals as an organization. I will mute myself right now and share the screen so you can see our website.
Yes, the website that we are very, very, very proud of. Okay, here's the website. Our organization is a little bit over a month old, but we are very optimistic. So I'm going to start with the very basics, right? Why did we create this organization in the very first place? So our name is, like Mishka said, the Internationalist Solidarity Alliance for Latin America, which tells you a lot about us, right? So we focus on Latin America, and we stand for one core belief, that the peoples of Latin America have the right to live and develop free of the imperial coercion. By empire, I mean the United States of America. So for decades, as you may know, sanctions, blockades, and political pressure have been used to control and punish nations of Latin America, right? So we all know about the many coups, the many, episodes of political instability in various countries. Right now, Cuba and Venezuela are the countries that experience the most urgent crisis, so we focus on them. However, this does not mean that we will not be creating content regarding other countries, and we will not be supporting other countries of Latin America. Of course, we will. So today, as pressure on the region intensifies, our task is clear as an organization. We commit to political education, obviously, to material solidarity by the nations, and that's why we have a special section here on our website, which is Donate to Cuba. Mishka, can you show it?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so here are the verified organizations that you are able to donate to. We are also in close contact with the Cuban Institute of People's Friendship. So if you have questions regarding solidarity events, solidarity brigades in Cuba, about other ways to support Cuba, we are able to connect you with the people in Cuba, with the people who are organizing all these events, because everybody is very, very welcome to join and to support Cuba. Same goes with Venezuela. As we have our Venezuelan comrade, we are able to navigate you through the process, donating to Venezuela or participating in certain initiatives. So we have this possibility to verify everything. So this is not the regional issue. Since most of us are not from Latin America, we need to clarify why we decided to create this specific organization. As you know, true worker solidarity knows no borders. And when people resist oppression anywhere, it strengthens the fight everywhere. So if we support Latin America today, this might support us, our countries in the future. Stand with us, guys, support us, stand for sovereignty, for dignity, for solidarity, and for justice. Hasta la victoria siempre. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will just also mention, since I'm showing you our website right now, that there are two very specific segments that you won't see on our social media. First segment is the articles. Right now we have articles about Chavez, Venezuela, about Marco Rubio, about the Gusano community, and the article about Vilma Espin is still in process. And also the segment that you won't see on our social media, but exclusively on our website, is the art gallery, where we post art in different sections. For instance, Cuba USS art section, where Comrade Masha lately created poster of Gagarin, for instance. Yes, and if you are wishing to collaborate with us in the future, contact us on social media, email, or wherever you prefer. We would be more than happy to collaborate. Thank you so much, Masha, for explaining our mission. Let's focus right now on the topic of today's meeting, that is Cuba and its geopolitical position. I would love to give voice to Comrade Marcelina so that she can explain to us what is currently happening in Cuba.
In order to understand the current events that are happening in Cuba right now, we must first have a brief look at the historical background, because without the history of Cuba in the last 70 years, we cannot understand why the Cuba-US relations are the way that they are currently. So as you can see here, I've grouped it under Cuba under Batista's dictatorship, Cuban Revolution, Cuba moved toward socialism, and the special period. So Fulgencio Batista, gained power in 1952 during his military coup, when he wanted to preemptively gain power because he was pretty much aware that he was going to lose the election that year. He managed to conduct this military coup with financial, military, and logistic support from the US government. The US government was very keen to ally with Batista for two reasons. First, this was the Cold War, and Batista outlawed the Communist Party in Cuba, which was seen as a step in the right direction and the direction that the US supported. The second reason was because Batista allied with wealthy landowners in Cuba. These landowners were very heavily skewed towards, well, the US elite. Let me give you some statistics. So US and foreign investors actually controlled 70% of arable land, which means the for agriculture, 90% of essential services, and 4% of sugar production, with sugar being the major industrial export that Cuba had. With the focus on wealthy landowners, concessions were made for these landowners. For example, strikes were suppressed, and actually a lot of the political liberties that Cuba enjoyed previously to Batista were suspended. With the income inequality growing due to the exploitation conducted by these wealthy landowners, the workers found themselves unable to strike, which essentially made it prime breeding ground for revolutionary movements and eventually gave birth to the Cuban Revolution. I don't think I have to summarize the Cuban Revolution, because I'm sure anyone interested in Cuba knows at least the basics. So I will skip forward in time to 1959 and continue with the conflict between Cuba and the United States. So the first thing that aggravated the United States to Fidel Castro and his government was that Fidel brought back the Communist Party, enacted an agrarian land reform law, which essentially made issues with the US wealthy investors, wealthy landowners, as they seized the land from these landowners and redistributed it to the peasants that had previously owned no land. These new landowners had no links to the United States and would not follow through on the ideas that the US government wanted to impose on Cuba. This all led to the worsening of Cuba-US relations, which culminated with 1960 Eisenhower greenlighting the CIA to start interventions within Cuba. Of course, we all know about the over 600 attempts at assassination on Fidel Castro, but also beyond that, the CIA was heavily involved with the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, when 1,400 Cuban exiles landed on the beaches of Cuba to start a revolution against Castro's government, and also the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Cuba was under threat. The Soviet Union sent missiles over to the island, and the United States reacted in turn. Sanctions began in the years 1960 to 1964 and just escalated as the years went on. And Cuba turned to commercial agreements with countries that were not influenced by the sanctions, such as the Soviet Union. So what is the special period? The special period occurred in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. With the collapse, the island saw a decrease in the subsidies the Soviet Union was sending over to Cuba, with losses amounting to up to $6 billion a year. So this is a huge amount of subsidies that Cuba is now missing out on. Throughout these years, up until 1995, Cuba lost 35% of the GDP of the island, which resulted in a huge worsening of living conditions, unemployment, and a humanitarian crisis. Cuba was only able to rebuild the GDP to pre-special period levels in the early 2000s. So the current crisis. As you can see here, I have 3 points: Trump, Venezuela, and the oil embargo, and all three are very deeply connected. On the 11th of January, Trump announced that Venezuela will no longer supply oil to Cuba. This comes after the January 3rd kidnapping of President Maduro. And then on the 29th of January, Trump exacerbated this further by issuing an executive order that threatened tariffs on any nation that would send oil to Cuba. So far, only oil from Russia has reached Cuba, and we have heard news that Mexico is also planning to send such over. The consequences are far-reaching. As you can see, you have power outages, humanitarian collapse, and sanctions. However, these all can be expanded on greatly, and it is all a huge circle because all of these are interconnected. Regional power outages and national blackouts have been common, as we have had 2 national blackouts since January, and the regional ones occur regularly. This also influences fuel shortages and the functioning of hospitals. Of course, without power, surgeries are greatly impeded. This is where the humanitarian crisis comes in. Not only are the hospitals impeded due to the power outages, but also other factors also include things like litter piling up in the streets, which leads to sanitation issues. There is no fuel to run the garbage trucks. There's no one to pick up the litter, disease can proliferate. And with disease spreading, there are no hospitals to treat the disease. Furthermore, even hospital staff are facing issues with even the simplest things, such as the commute to work. Public transport has been reduced due to fuel shortage, and simply doctors cannot get to work. The same is true for teachers and other workers around Cuba. And of course, something that is very common in every household, but we don't really think about, is cooking and water. With a lack of fuel, we are unable to cook food properly. We need water. What is this? Bacteria present in food cannot be killed by the high temperature. Bacteria in water also cannot be killed by the same means. But disease, once again, can spread without these problems. As you can see here, I managed to pull up a statistical feature. So health study found that amount of excess debt due to sanctions is 560 people dying every single year. Deaths could have been avoided had sanctions not been in place.
Thank you so much, Marcelina. That was a great presentation and a great recap. Let's move to the main discussion segment. Right now, I am going to ask each of ISALA members to share their thoughts and opinions on a specific topic related to the current Cuban politics. After that, we are going to have open question segment so that you can also be involved in the conversation. So let's start with Comrade Masha. The first question for you is, how would you describe Cuban-Russian political relations?
Well, you know, guys, I'm sure that you all are aware of the history of relations between the Soviet Union and Cuba, right? So the relationship began short after the Cuban Revolution because, you know, when Fidel Castro communicated with many countries, Soviet Union was the one who actually showed active support to the, you know, Cuban regime, the communist regime. And that is why over the course of many decades, Cuba and the USSR have built very strong connection. The bond that was unfortunately kind of damaged in year 1991 when the Soviet Union was destroyed, right? And for about a decade, there was little to no connections. So the Soviet Union, Russia after that, they have withdrawn all the troops from Cuba. They have stopped many initiatives in Cuba, for example, building the nuclear station, right, which would have, you know, significantly helped Cuba with its energy situation. So all of that has been terminated. But when Vladimir Putin came to power in year 2000, that has changed. Cuba and Russia have restored their relations. And ever since, I would say that Russia has consistently showed political, economic, energy, and other types of support to the Cuban people. Also, from my personal perspective, I can say that Cuba has a very special place in every Russian's heart because we kind of feel, this strong comradeship even up to this day. I was raised in love with Cuba, and I think that's a reality for many, many, many Russian families. That is why when it comes to support, it's never about purely, even though that Russia is capitalist now, it's not only about trading, it's not only about the economic relations, it's more about, support and friendship. So I can say, yes, there are three dimensions of Cuba-Russia relations, which are political, economic, and diplomatic. So Russia is trying to support Cuba on, many political platforms, including the UN, also showing economic support and cooperation in terms of also scientific research and political support. So whenever Cuba experiences pressure from the United States, Russia is there to, have their backs. Regarding the recent developments, right? Let me jump into this year, 2026, right? And what Marcelina has mentioned, after Maduro's kidnapping, clearly there was no oil to send to Cuba, right? Especially after Trump threatened to impose tariffs to countries that will sell oil to Cuba. Russia did not pay attention to that and sent the tanker anyway, which, the tanker actually arrived in Cuba with about 700,000 barrels of oil. And it was not sent for selling. It was sent as a humanitarian donation, basically. As you know, Cuba has severe shortages, right? And this amount of oil will not serve for a long time, probably a month. It will last for about a month. But Russia has promised to continue support. Russian energy minister has expressed his will to send more tankers and send more, there are other types of, economic support, of energy support. You can always send solar panels. You can always send food like China does, for example, right? And you can help with many, many other aspects. We've all, followed this Nuestra América convoy story when people arrived with humanitarian aid, right? Mexico sent humanitarian aid many times. But I mean, we kind of have to agree that the Russian assistance was the crucial one. Finally, I would say that the prospects of Cuba-Russia's relations are very promising, at least I hope so. And let me demonstrate my screen very quickly to show you one memorable event which took place in 2022. So this monument dedicated to Fidel Castro, as you can see here it says Fidel, was basically opened in 2022. It was a state initiative, which we also had a big contest for all the, sculptors and architects who could participate and plan how to how it should look, where it should be put, etc. As you can see, here we have the Cuban president, right? Miguel Diaz-Canel, who came to Russia, to Moscow specifically for this opening. And here we see Vladimir Putin, who initiated. Fidel Castro has a very special place in our hearts because Fidel personally traveled all around the Soviet Union back in times. Actually, he traveled in the 60s, in the 70s, and in the 80s. He was in Russia many, many times, even after the Soviet Union's destruction. So I would say that, yes, we feel like we need to continue our support and we will continue it on all fronts possible.
I have to admit that I'm very impressed because with one question, you perfectly answered the other two I had prepared for you.
Okay.
But
yes,
that's
I kind of
all
jumped
right.
into all of them.
Would you like to maybe add something more, or?
Well, I could only add that there were initially 2 tankers planned. However, due to the sanctions policies, as you know, currently Russia is the most sanctioned nation on earth, even more sanctioned than Iran. So it's kind of hard to organize such a long distance delivery. The first tanker was registered in Hong Kong, and also the shipment, you have to use a lot of agents while you deliver this amount of oil. Actually, the first tanker was quite small. It only held, I believe, it only carried about 200,000 barrels, not 700,000. But still, would have been nice if it could arrive, you know? However, due to the sanctions, due to some, I guess, diplomatic issues, it did not reach its goal and it diverted from the, from the original path. But yes, this current tanker, Anatoly Kolodkin, it's state registered and it is sanctioned. However, it was backed by the Russian Navy and Donald Trump allowed it to enter the Cuban territorial waters.
Thank you so much for your answers. And right now, let's move again to Marcelina, to our Polish Venezuelan comrade. So my first question for you, they will be, of course, about Venezuela. First question is kind of similar to what I asked Masha about. How would you describe Cuban-Venezuelan political relations? Do those two countries fight in the same cause? That is against American imperialism.
Thank you for your question. So when it comes to Venezuela and the fight against US imperialism, it is very much united with Cuba on this front, unequivocally. By Che in his diaries from the revolution, he specifically mentions Caracas offering support to the Cuban revolutionaries. After the revolution succeeded, Castro actually came to Caracas in January 1959, where he was unanimously hailed as a hero for continental South America. But this is where we get to the slight issue, the Venezuelan-Cuban relationship in this period, because the Venezuelan presidents Romulo Betancourt and later Raúl Leoni were very affiliated with the United States and were staunchly anti-communist. They were very much members of the land-owning elite and wanted to keep themselves and their fellow wealthy landowners in power, which is why I mentioned the split between the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan people. Because during this time, the Venezuelan people continued the fight against US imperialism and continued the fight that Cuba started. In fact, throughout the 60s and 70s, Cuba and Fidel Castro specifically supplied revolutionaries in Venezuela with training, with supplies. They flew quite a few of them to Cuba, and that allowed them to train with the Cuban revolutionaries to come back and try to start revolution in Venezuela. Unfortunately, every attempt failed. The revolution did not manage to take hold in Venezuela, mainly due to the ruling class's vehement beating down of any guerrilla unit that they found. The Betancourt and Leoni's armies were very good, unfortunately, at rooting out the revolutionaries, especially as Venezuela was not as, let's say, open to the idea as other South American countries might have been. This, of course, all changed with Chavez. Hugo Chavez came to power in 1998 with the election. He did have a failed coup attempt where he wanted to start a revolution from the army barracks, very similarly to Fidel, actually. There are a lot of parallels to be placed between Fidel and Chavez. However, Chavez's revolution of 1992 did not succeed. When he came to power in 1998, he spoke of Fidel Castro as his brother. I have a quote here that I would like to share to you from Chavez's visit to Havana in 1999, a year after his election. Venezuela is traveling towards the same sea as the Cuban people. And I believe this is the perfect quote to encapsulate Venezuela's policies towards Cuba and towards the US even in the last 28 years. Along with Cuba, Venezuela is traveling along the same sea, the sea towards socialism, the sea towards a world of Latin America being free from US imperialism. US imperialism is quoted by Bolivar as being the specter that will haunt Latin America. And Chavez always quoted Bolivar. That's why it's called the Bolivarian Revolution. Simon Bolivar was incredibly important to Chavez. Both Chavez and later Maduro maintained contact with Cuba and maintained relations with them. So they were a very key international partner, as both countries were within Latin America, both were moving towards socialism. So, for example, as part of the comprehensive cooperative agreement, in exchange for Venezuela's oil, Cuba sent personnel. The key sectors that Cuba sent personnel to are the healthcare, education, sport, and science and technology. So, as I'm sure you know, Cuba was redeveloping at a very rapid pace in these sectors, and Venezuela was lagging behind. Therefore, the assistance that these professionals could lend Venezuela was invaluable. And as such, an agreement was signed in exchange for the oil. These healthcare professionals, education professionals helped formulate and run social programs within Venezuela, social reforms that were aiming to improve the living conditions of everyday Venezuelans without the boots of US imperialism. They were trying to assist Venezuela in creating an economy that isn't completely dependent on exports to the United States or imports of goods from the United States.
It was a very comprehensive answer. And could you please describe in a few words to describe the current situation after the American forces cut the Venezuelan oil from Cuba, and more important, did the situation got significantly worse in your opinion?
Thank you. In the previous years, in 2019, Juan Guaido decreased the amount of oil sent to Cuba, but keyword decreased. He only decreased the sending of oil. The kidnapping of Maduro on the 3rd of January this year cut the support completely. No Venezuelan oil is currently entering Cuba. Unfortunately, the coup against Maduro has been in the works within the United States government for a long time, for many years now. And I think I'm not the only one that says that I was predicting this to have happened from the last 2 years, maybe even. 32 Cubans lost their lives on the 3rd of January. Cuba and Venezuela have a long-standing history of using Cuban military and intelligence personnel within Venezuela, and both Chavez and Maduro had their personal security teams comprised heavily of Cubans. So unfortunately, out of the military officials killed on the 3rd of January, 32 of these were Cuban.
Thank you so much. Those were the great answers. So right now, let's ask Comrade Carlo about the economical situation. So, Carlo, the first question I have for you, in a few words, could you describe what was the reason behind the US decision to put such huge embargo on Cuba, and whose decision was that?
This is an allegation of US imperialism, just expressed in a more offensive way, right? To address the Cuban people and their revolution. Now, to contextualize this, we have to point out that this is not the first time the US does this, right? Because maybe some people could say it's just Trump. No, it's not. The USA had always done like this ever since the Cuban Revolution. And well, Marcelina, I think she had pointed out before, but I would like to underscore that even more. When John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1963 published CACR, which is basically Cuban Assets Control Regulations, the US had total control on every asset and on every influx of people visiting Cuba, and this basically expanded all over the years after the USSR collapsed, right? Then, yes, Marcelina talked about the so-called special period, and after that, we could say that between 1995 and 2019, Cuba was actually undergoing a relatively good period, right? Raw cost reforms had improved Cuban economy, and now we could see how recovery, as I said, began in the mid 1990s, and it extended into the 20s, right? It was characterized by steady, if even though limited expansion. The GDP increased from approximately 3.6 billion in 2000 to 42.6 billion in 2005 and 59.6 billion by 2010. So it is a steady growth, actually. But this growth was driven by a combination of factors, including the expansion of international tourism, limited market-oriented reforms, which in Spanish they're called cooperativas no agropecuarias. So basically cooperatives, not agricultural cooperatives, right? So we see that with Raul Castro, with the slow fading of the figure of Fidel Castro, his brother Raul Castro slowly liberalized the Cuban market in order to make it more competitive and to improve the Cuban economy, right? As Marcelina has pointed out before, the revolution of Hugo Chavez had improved the Cuban economy for all of the years. We could say that the 2000 were actually a period of good growth. But yeah, I would focus on the Obama period right now, the period from especially from 2010 and 2015, in which the GDP rose from approximately $69 billion in 2011 to 87.1 billion in 2015, right? With a growth reaching a plus 4.4% increase over the years. So it was a relatively steady growth. And this expansion was supported by economic reforms, as I said before, by Raul Castro, but also thanks to Obama, because we could say that if the United States had constantly oppressed the Cuban people, Obama was relatively better than the other presidents. From 26 to 2019, the Cuban economy entered a phase of stagnation, even because, Donald J. Trump was elected and he's a self-declared capitalist and nationalist, so he has no interest in defending the Cubans. He just wants to, expand his market and possibly extend his hegemony on the Cuban people, and just draw profit from it. By 2019, the Cuban GDP had reached approximately 103.4 billion. But the slowdown reflected structural inefficiencies, declining Venezuelan support, and tightening U.S. sanctions. And then, with the pandemic period of COVID-19, a major contraction triggered the Cuban economy because, as you know, after the collapse of the USSR, Cuba had to rely on tourism, right? On tourism economy, right? But this was not more possible during the pandemic period. And so basically Cuba underwent one of its most damaging crises over the years. Now, this contraction was driven by the collapse of international tourism and disruption to imports and remittances and broader global economic dislocation, right? The real GDP fell significantly during this period, reflecting both external shocks and pre-existing structural vulnerabilities. The post-pandemic period, so 2021 and 2023, was characterized by weak and inconsistent recovery followed by renewed decline. Biden didn't really help. I mean, Trump did neither, but yeah. I don't know if I answered, if I'm missing out on something, if you want.
No, you answered perfectly, and I would like to thank you very much for this answer. Yes, and right now let's move to Comrade Giza, and I will ask her about so-called gusanos in the United States. So, Giza, my first question for you is, what is the political statement of most, I highlight most, of the Cuban American community in the US? Are they pro or anti-US sanctions, and why?
Okay, thank you so much for the question. As I see, the majority of Cuban Americans are firmly anti-leftist, and this causes them to be anti-Castro. It's because they claim that Fidel stole the hopes and dreams of generations, which is, we all know it, this is simply not true. Their hotspot is found in Miami because geographically it's the closest to Cuba. And yes, the shores of Miami is the closest to Havana. And to Gusanos, any and every political party that just like has a tendency to lean to the left, they have this allergic reaction to it because they fear socialism like it's fire, or even worse, it's the end of the world. And let me tell you why. The main reason is because back in 1962, during the Bay of Pigs invasion, President Kennedy basically abandoned the project at a very crucial moment. And this is a scar or trauma that Cuban Americans will probably never hear from. And as we all know, President Kennedy was a Democrat president, and while the Democrats are no close to socialism, Gusanos still think that they are, I mean, the Democrats are socialists, which is also not true, obviously, because why would America let a socialist party to lead the country to begin with? And they also view they are pro-sanctionists, most of them, because they view it as a tool to pressure the government. And if I'm being very honest, these Gusanos wouldn't even care if the US nuked their homeland and would even cheer on it for doing so. And I think, and I know that I'm not alone on this, it's really shameful, because why would you wish for a country to be destroyed even though you left it for the better, especially if it's destroyed by a foreign country that you are currently residing in? And this leads to the next topic to explore the term of Gusano and where it came from and the history. So the term Gusano was first used in the early 60s by Vilma Espin and Fidel Castro in their speeches, and it seems like to have stuck during the years. I like this term very much. This is a very fitting term to describe Cuban Americans, because this is simply just what they are. They are worms. Because they, as I mentioned before, they left Cuba for a better future just because a new socialist government didn't fit their luxurious needs and ideas. So for them, what was the only reasonable thing to do? Leave. Like a coward would do, let's be honest.
And the last question I have for you is, what do you think about Marco Rubio and his policy towards Cuba? In a few words, if you could tell us.
Okay, so I will try to keep it family friendly. Marco Rubio, I think he's a pathetic coward. He's the star and the patron saint of Gusanos, because he resembles that even someone from a Cuban immigrant family can make it this big. And it's one thing that he's a Republican. And I say that this would not be the biggest problem, because Cuban Americans tend to be Republicans. The problem is that he doesn't claim to be Cuban. He thinks that he is one of them. He can integrate himself fully into the Trump administration, but he doesn't realize that they will never view him as an equal. And also, he's also obviously very, very anti-socialist and anti-Castro. And I think, in my opinion, that he knows that he's in the wrong, or the entire Trump administration is in the wrong, but he would never act up. It would be the only reasonable thing to do, to act up or to say something, but come on, like, we saw and we knew that he can't even tell his boss that the shoe doesn't even fit him. So why do we think that he would tell Donald Trump to stop putting sanctions and stop suffocating Cuba?
Well, thank you so much. It was a very comprehensive response and a very great one too. Also with a little bit of humor that I think everyone enjoyed. And right now, let's move to our last ISALA member, that is Elena. After her answers, we will move to the last segment of the conference, that is open questions panel. So I will ask Elena about the Cuban women's situation on the island. And so, Elena, first question for you. Could you please tell us about the current position of Cuban women? Here, I mean their impact on politics, mainly.
Cuban women are 55.7% in the government. So it's a totally equal system there. And it's important to mention the Cuban Women's Federation, Federación de Mujeres Cubanas, which is essentially a part of the government, I would say that, but it's still an organization. And I think the reason why Cuban women could go so far is because the Women's Federation played along with the government. And there are problems, however, and we shouldn't put a blind eye on these, because one of the biggest things that Cuban Women's Federation, in my opinion, Fidel Castro fought was prostitution. They lifted up these women from prostitution to give them a job and education. But as the embargo put such a big stamp on Cuba, especially in the last few years, prostitution became a thing again. And it's illegal in Cuba, but they still trying to do these. A lot of girls walk on the streets and trying to get tourists, bring them to their rooms. And I think it's a really big problem because Cuban women have such big opportunities. And most of the time, Cuban women have higher levels of education than men. So they could literally do anything, but still the challenges that they're facing somehow created this new law. And the Cuban Women's Federation takes a part in the everyday life. So like Carlo mentioned, the COVID-19, also during that period, the Cuban Women's Federation participated in this difficult time with suppliances and identifying sick people or weak people.
And the last question I have for you, could you tell us some details about the latest Women's March in Cuba against the US blockade? What happened? How did the manifestation go? Could you give us some details, please?
In the 7th of April, there was a huge march of the Cuban Women's Federation. They did this to celebrate Vilma Spin's 96th birthday, but also against the US blockade. And they marched in Havana. They started at 9:30 a.m. So very early, and I actually listened to the talk about this prior day in the radio. They advocated for the end of the blockade, which is taking a toll on Cuba, and basically there are protests all the time. And they just want the world to hear their voices and to finally listen up to Cuba. They posted a lot about this actually in their Facebook, and I recommend you to check it out on the Federación de Mujeres Cubanas Facebook.
Thank you again for your answers. So, dear listeners and dear comrades, I think that we can move to our open questions segment. So, now it is your time to participate in our conference. Please, you can raise your hand or write questions in the chat if you don't want to unmute yourself and speak. I will read the questions, accept them or not if they may be inappropriate, but I don't think that we will have this issue. And then I will ask if maybe one of the ISALA members is willing to answer them. So take your time, raise your hand or write questions in the chat, in the Zoom chat, and we will be more than happy to answer them.
What are you planning your next step to be, like beside those conferences? Are you planning to maybe start some protests or anything like that? What's the plan for the changes you're planning to bring into the world?
Oh, all right, Masha, you can answer.
I think I can start and you guys can add whatever you feel like. So I would say that it's a very complex situation. We are all from different countries, right? And we have absolutely different opportunities of helping. For example, my donations possibilities and like my Russian comrades' donation possibilities are very limited because we are cut out of SWIFT and cut out of all banking operations. That's why our donations won't really help much. But the girls are able to do that and they're continuing to do that. And we hope to raise awareness in regards to donations. Plus, as I said, we have contacts inside Cuba, right? And this Institute of People's Friendship is a very important organizer of all pro-Cuba events. And because they are aware of our work and of our existence, they are in close contact with us. And whenever they have something to announce or they want us to bring participants, we collaborate with them. So, for example, we were announcing the rally in Paris, right? We also try to publish the Russian organization's announcement, the Russian Fidel Castro's fund announcement, because we are celebrating Fidel's anniversary this year and we have a lot of peaceful, events happening, for example, contests, essays, whatever, like basically raising awareness and education. So we will hope to announce that as well. Regarding protests, so since we are from different countries, it's kind of hard to, create something together in the same geographical location. So what we will continue to do is continue to, raise awareness about the protests and rallies and other things that are happening, and whoever is able to participate will. The next step is growing our audience, and potentially we hope with my comrades, I think they will support me in that, to travel to Cuba together, to possibly join the Solidarity Brigade when it's possible, because each dollar counts. Can I say that? No, let's keep dollar out of it. Anyway, we have to travel to Cuba. We have to participate in Cuba's initiatives, because everything else is good, but we need to bring money to Cuba. That's basically the purpose. Bring money, bring resources, bring other types of aid. That's the plan. Yeah, and convoys that are being arranged, right? We will announce them. And if anyone can join, any of our comrades, we would be very happy.
As ISALA, because due to what Masha said, that we are from different countries, and even me and Marcela, even though we are from the same country, we basically live in the two different regions across Poland, right? So as Masha said, it is very difficult to organize something right now, right here, like physically. This is why ISALA mainly focuses on raising awareness on the internet, for instance, creating news, creating videos or other information materials that critique and boycott the US actions against Cuba. But also we believe that not only the information campaign is important, but also donating, because looking realistically, we are all the regular average working class people, and it is not really possible for us to just go to Cuba anytime right now. So the best thing we can do is not only raise awareness, but also raise money. This is why we on our website have a separate segment to donate to Cuba. And for instance, me and Marcela do it monthly, regularly, and it takes a very significant percent of our budget each month. Also, what I wanted to say is that me and Marcela are in the same organization. They are called the Reds in Poland, and basically right now we are focusing on preparing for the 1st of May. But later, after this, when we finish, we would like to focus on creating the possibility so we could, as an organization in Poland, legally raise money and donations and send them to Cuba to donate even more. Also, the Reds are collaborating with German communists. And we have a lot of achievements, for instance, sending money or solar panels to Cuba.
I wanted to mention other donation opportunities and contacts we have. Masha mentioned our connections with organizations in Cuba. Mishka mentioned our donations to Cuba. I want to build on both those points and say that I am actually personally currently working on both contacts and donation opportunities for grassroots organizations within Venezuela that work to overcome US sanctions within the country and work against the US imperialist agenda. So more on that coming soon. So we will have soon an opportunity to donate to these organizations as well.
Yes, and it will also appear on our website. Thank you for this voice, and let's give a voice to Elena.
So I don't know when I will be able to go to Cuba, but when I will be able, I was thinking about connecting the Cuban Women's Federation, and I wanted to bring some aid to, like, a smaller donation, obviously, regarding women's hygiene products like pads and things like that. And I was thinking about connecting the FMC for this.
Basically, our two main goals is the educational campaign and donations, because this is basically the two most realistic things we can do, and each of us outside of ISALA also acts to help Cuba however we can.
So since the founding of this organization on March 1st, we have been focused on building a space, right, dedicated to political education, awareness raising, to material solidarity with Cuba, because our most urgent issue is to preserve Cuba as it is right now, is to help them resist and to help them basically stay sovereign. Yes. And and of course, we want to continue our work from the Marxist-Leninist perspective. We have built our website, social media platforms, and we continue to, expanding our audience. We work to grow a base of supporters, both online and offline, and we hope to organize people, both online and out, offline and out there in the fields, right? So that's why we keep announcing some events that happen in real life. We have published several analytical pieces aimed at deepening understanding of the Cuban situation, and we will continue to do so. We also publish news weekly, and we hope that it might keep people updated, and we are trying to be as objective as possible and try to verify our news sources every time, because as you know, every media source is biased, and the Cuban people don't have enough voice in the modern media, international media. And we always bring, a broader political context, since all of us are from different countries. We have also been active in raising awareness around the impact of the US oil blockade. Obviously, Cuba has been living under the US economic blockade for several decades, right? Up to 70 years. But right now it's an oil blockade, which is causing a humanitarian catastrophe in real life. So we don't know how the situation continues to develop, but we are going to follow it, and we are going to do as much as we can with the limited resources that we have. Overall, our work has aimed to combine political education, material support, and culture into something that can help build real awareness and collective action. Patria o muerte.
Thank you, Masha. Sadly, I have to announce the official ending of the conference. It was such a pleasure to have you here, comrades. I hope you enjoyed the meeting, and I believe that this is the beginning of a wonderful community. Thank you so much for all the support, and please visit our social media and the website. Thank you so much, and this is the official ending.